The wind howled across the frozen asphalt like a warning no one could hear. Snow had piled in dirty banks on the sides of the highway, and the sun, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a pale smudge behind thick gray clouds. It was the kind of cold that bit through fur and skin alike. But there, curled up on the icy shoulder of the road, was a German shepherd named Maggie, her body wrapped protectively around her 4 tiny puppies. She didn't shiver anymore. Her instincts had pushed her beyond discomfort. Now, all that mattered was keeping them alive. Each time a semi-truck roared past, the ground trembled beneath her. The wind that followed each vehicle swept snow into the air like ash from a fire. Still, Maggie didn't move. Her eyes, dark and alert, scanned every vehicle with suspicion. She didn't know who to trust anymore. She had once had a home. She remembered warmth, the smell of bacon, a gentle voice, but that life was long gone. Now there was only the road, the cold, and the constant threat of being seen and ignored. Her puppies, barely 6 weeks old, nestled into her thick fur. Rusty, the boldest, kept trying to peek out from beneath her leg. Daisy, ever sensitive, pressed her tiny face into Maggie's chest, as if trying to disappear. Buddy, strong and solid, stayed close to the edge, keeping the others warm. And then there was Charlie, the smallest and quietest, whose breathing was shallow, his energy fading with the falling temperature. Maggie gently licked his ear, as if her love could bring him back from the edge. Cars continued to pass, hundreds of them, each one blurring into the next. Nobody stopped. Nobody noticed. Maggie had chosen this particular spot because there was a slight dip in the road where trucks sometimes slowed down. She hoped, prayed in whatever way a mother dog can, that someone would see them. But hour after hour passed, and nothing changed. Just the endless hum of rubber on ice, the white noise of indifference. Her paws were cracked, her nipples raw from feeding. Her breath came in short bursts now, but she refused to lie down completely. She had to remain alert. If a coyote came, if a snowplow veered too far, if a pup wandered out, there were too many ways to die out here. But Maggie had no intention of letting that happen. Not on her watch. And then, a sound broke the pattern. Slower tires, crunching snow, a truck pulling over. Maggie didn't move, didn't blink. She just watched, her muscles tense, her heart pounding. Was this the end? Or the beginning of something she didn't dare hope for? The truck door creaked open with a metallic groan, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the icy ground. Walt Jenkins squinted against the sharp wind as he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades on the road, instinctively reached for the thermos in his coat pocket. But then he saw her. Just off the shoulder, huddled in the snow, was a German shepherd, still as stone, with 4 puppies tucked beneath her like living cargo. His breath caught in his chest. "Lord Almighty," he muttered, the steam from his voice curling into the air. Walt had seen a lot in his 67 years. Wrecks, abandonments, people left behind. But this was different. There was something about the dog's eyes that struck him. She didn't look panicked. She looked resigned, as if she had accepted the fate the world had dealt her, and all she asked now was to be left in peace. But those pups, so small, barely moving, that wasn't right. Not in this cold. Not next to a highway where one wrong step could mean the end. He took a slow step forward, then stopped. Maggie raised her head slightly, her ears flattening, her body stiffening over the puppies. A low growl rumbled from her throat. Not aggressive, but firm. A warning, "I'll fight if I have to." Walt nodded softly. "Easy, girl. I ain't here to hurt ya," he said, crouching slowly. His knees cracked as he lowered himself to the snow, the chill biting through his jeans. "I just want to help." He noticed the way she curled tighter around them when the wind picked up, her body trembling with effort. One of the pups, Charlie, though Walt didn't know his name yet, let out a weak, wheezing cough. It was faint, but unmistakable. The old man's heart dropped. He'd heard that sound before, in the shelters in the cold when it was already almost too late. "You've been out here too long, haven't ya?" he whispered. Walt glanced back toward his truck. It was warm inside. He had blankets, leftover meatloaf, a heater that still worked. He hadn't planned on stopping. Hell, he was just running a short delivery before heading back to his wife, Eileen. But now, staring at this mother risking everything for her babies, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not when someone had already decided they didn't matter. So he did the only thing his conscience would let him do. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the last piece of jerky he had, and gently laid it in the snow in front of her. "You trust me. Just enough," he whispered. "That's all we need to start." Walt remained crouched in the snow, his knees aching and his fingers stinging from the cold, but he didn't move. Maggie hadn't taken the jerky yet. She stared at it, then at him, eyes sharp and full of questions. There was a flicker of calculation in her gaze. She was weighing risk against survival. Walt had seen that look before in people who'd been hurt too many times. Trust didn't come easy when the world had already turned its back on you. Behind her, the pups stirred. Rusty let out a soft, curious whine, nudging Maggie's side with his nose. Charlie coughed again, weaker this time. That sound made Walt flinch. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the highway around him disappeared. All he could hear was that fragile gasp. It was the sound of a life flickering, like a candle fighting against the wind. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "You're not gonna lose him. Not today." Walt slowly rose to his feet, brushing snow from his jeans. The cold had crept deep into his joints, but it wasn't what made him hesitate. He glanced back at his truck again. It wasn't just a matter of bringing the dogs inside. It was what came after. If he brought them in, he was taking on more than just a temporary rescue. He was inviting responsibility, emotional weight, and maybe even heartbreak. He'd promised Eileen after their last shelter foster passed away, "No more. I can't bury another." And yet, as he looked back down at Maggie, still refusing to eat, still guarding with every ounce of strength left in her body, something shifted inside him. It wasn't pity. It was respect. Admiration, even. That dog had more fight in her than most men he'd known. She had no reason to trust him, and yet she hadn't run. That meant something. Maybe everything. "All right," he said aloud, as if speaking to himself more than her. "I'll do it." He took off his coat and laid it on the ground beside her, then stepped back slowly. "Peace offering." Maggie stared at it, then slowly, cautiously, stretched her neck forward and picked up the jerky. Her jaws moved slowly, deliberately. It wasn't hunger. It was a gesture. A truce. Walt turned toward the truck and opened the passenger side door wide, letting the warmth spill out into the frozen air. He looked back at Maggie. "Come on, Mama," he said gently. "Let's get you and your babies out of the cold." The warmth hit Maggie like a wave the moment she stepped into the cab of the truck. The contrast was almost too much. Her muscles, frozen tight for days, began to release in small tremors. She hesitated at the door, giving one last glance toward the snow behind her. Then, slowly and with surprising grace, she climbed up, one paw at a time, cradling her fragile world of puppies beneath her. Walt had spread his flannel coat across the passenger seat, and she laid down on it as if it were a throne. The pups collapsed into her side, their tiny bodies finally beginning to relax. Walt closed the door gently, sealing them in from the biting cold. He sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he watched her through the rearview mirror. Maggie didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, yet holding everything. Exhaustion, suspicion, pain, and something deeper, like the memory of trust once given and then broken. Walt had seen that look in the mirror before, after the war, after the divorce, after he buried his brother. It was the look of someone who had lost too much. Rusty lifted his head first, sniffing the air curiously before collapsing back onto Maggie's chest. Daisy tucked herself beneath her mother's chin. Buddy took the edge, always the guard, his little eyes barely staying open. But Charlie didn't move. His breathing was faint, his sides barely rising. Walt glanced down at the pup, and his throat tightened. "We need to move," he murmured. The truck roared to life, heater blasting warm air into the cab. Walt turned onto the back road, away from the highway. He knew of a vet's office about 20 minutes out. Small, old-fashioned, run by a woman who'd stitched up half the strays in the county. Dr. Martha Sinclair. She didn't ask questions. She just helped. It wasn't a hospital, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. As the tires crunched over ice and slush, Maggie didn't sleep. She kept her head low, ears flicking at every sound. Even safe inside, the trauma of the road hadn't left her. Every noise was a potential threat. Every bump a reason to brace herself. Walt knew that kind of tension. It didn't go away overnight. He didn't try to pet her. He didn't speak much. He just drove. Slowly, carefully, as if carrying something sacred. Because in some strange, unexpected way, he was. The porch light of the old vet clinic flickered against the falling snow as Walt pulled his truck to a stop. The building was small, once a farmhouse, now converted into a place of quiet healing. A wooden sign above the door read Sinclair Veterinary Care, its paint chipped by years of rain and wind. Walt stepped out, boots crunching on the frozen gravel, and walked quickly to the passenger door. Maggie was alert now, her ears forward, her body tense. She didn't like change. She especially didn't like doors. Inside, the scent of antiseptic mixed with cedarwood and old coffee. A bell chimed as Walt pushed open the door. From the back room emerged a woman in her late 60s, hair tied back in a loose braid, eyes sharp behind silver-rimmed glasses. Dr. Martha Sinclair had seen this kind of scene before. A man with the weight of the world in his eyes and something broken in his arms. She didn't speak right away. Just took one look at Maggie through the windshield and nodded. "Bring her in." Walt carried Charlie first. The pup felt weightless in his hands, which made it worse. Maggie whimpered as the door opened, but didn't lunge or bark. She just watched, muscles twitching, ready to spring if needed. Walt whispered gently, "I'll bring him back, Mama," before turning and handing Charlie over to Martha's steady arms. Her touch was practiced but kind. She pressed her ear to his chest, her expression tightening. "He's weak," she said softly. "Hypothermia, and maybe pneumonia, but we're not giving up." While Charlie was taken to a warm pad under a heating lamp, Walt returned to the truck. This time, Maggie stood halfway up, blocking the others. He didn't push. He crouched low, eye level, and spoke to her like a friend. "You gave me a chance once. Just one. Give her one too." Maggie didn't move at first, but then, slowly, she stepped aside, allowing Walt to scoop up Daisy, then Rusty, then Buddy. She followed last, hesitant, every step calculated, but she followed. Inside, the clinic felt strange. Too clean, too bright. Maggie stayed close to the corner, her body always between her pups and everyone else. But she didn't growl. She just watched. Dr. Martha, kneeling nearby, didn't reach for her. She simply sat, quiet, present. Two mothers, different species, but speaking the same silent language of loss, survival, and hope. And for the first time since the snow began to fall, Maggie blinked slowly and laid her head down. The clinic had grown silent. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit, brushing against the windows with icy fingers. Inside, the lights had been dimmed, and the only sound was the soft hum of a space heater and the faint beeping of a heart monitor. Charlie lay curled under a warm blanket, his tiny body barely moving, ribs rising and falling so subtly it made your heart ache just to watch. Maggie sat close, her nose resting on the edge of the heating pad, eyes never leaving him. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She was holding on with him, moment by moment. Dr. Martha Sinclair moved with quiet urgency, adjusting fluids and checking his temperature every half hour. Her face showed no panic, but Walt could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way her fingers hovered for a second longer over his chest. She'd lost animals before, too many, but this felt different. Maybe it was the mother watching nearby. Maybe it was the stillness in the room, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Walt sat in a worn chair nearby, his hands clasped between his knees. He hadn't said much in hours. Eileen had called earlier, her voice soft with concern. "Do what your heart tells you," she said, without needing to hear the full story. And that's exactly what he was doing, even if it tore him up inside. Watching a life dangle between two worlds was something he'd hoped he'd never face again. But here he was, and so was Maggie. At one point during the night, Charlie let out a small, raspy cry. Maggie perked up immediately, nudging him gently with her nose. He didn't move, but the sound meant something. It was a fight, a sign. Martha looked up from her notes, caught Walt's eye, and gave the faintest nod. "He's still in there," she whispered. "He's still trying." Walt stood, walked to the table, and placed a hand gently on Maggie's back. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at him, but she allowed it. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. At 3 a.m., Martha placed a small syringe of antibiotics into Charlie's leg and exhaled slowly. "Now we wait," she said. "No grand speeches. No promises. Just the quiet war of survival. Fought with blankets, heat, medicine, and the unwavering presence of a mother who refused to give up." Maggie didn't move from his side all night. And just before dawn, in the dim orange glow of a clinic lamp, Charlie took a deep breath, fuller than before. Maggie's ears twitched, and Walt, for the first time in years, felt tears run down his face. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of the clinic, casting a soft amber glow across the room. Charlie's breathing had steadied, though still shallow, and his little paws twitched slightly in sleep. The heater continued its quiet work, wrapping the room in warmth. Maggie had not moved an inch through the night, her eyes heavy but open. She had stood guard long enough, and now, seeing Charlie's chest rise and fall with rhythm again, her body finally gave in. She lowered herself completely and closed her eyes. Not in defeat, in fragile relief. Dr. Martha stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. "He's not out of the woods," she murmured to Walt. "But he made it through the night. That says something." Walt nodded, wiping the back of his hand across tired eyes. He'd sat up all night too, not out of duty, but because something about this dog, this little family, had planted itself deep in his chest. He'd seen courage before, but this was something else. This was survival wrapped in fur and silence. Later that morning, Daisy, Rusty, and Buddy were given warm formula and a space to stretch in the small recovery room. They wobbled on unsteady legs, play-fighting and nipping at one another, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. Maggie watched them closely, but for the first time since Walt had found them, her gaze was softer. The threat had eased. Still, she flinched slightly each time someone opened a door, as if her instincts wouldn't let her forget where she had come from. Walt walked outside to call Eileen. His voice was calm, but worn. "We'll be coming back with more than I left with," he said. On the other end of the line, Eileen chuckled softly. "I figured. What do you need me to set up?" That was the kind of woman she was. No questions, just action. Walt paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "A place to rest. For all of them. And some soft blankets if we've got any left in the basement." There was a silence, then her voice again, this time warmer. "I'll take care of it. You just drive safe." By noon, Maggie had eaten a full meal, and Charlie had managed to sit upright with help. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the vet to nod approvingly. "He'll need weeks to recover," she said. "But he's strong." Walt approached Maggie, knelt beside her, and whispered, "Let's go home." She looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but permission. So he opened the truck door once more, and this time Maggie climbed in first. The sun was setting when Walt turned the old pickup truck down the long gravel driveway. His cabin sat at the edge of the woods, just outside of town. Modest, quiet, with a big wraparound porch and the scent of pine always in the air. As the truck approached, the porch light flicked on, casting a warm yellow glow across the steps. Eileen was already standing there, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She didn't wave or speak. She just watched, her eyes already full. Walt parked slowly and opened the passenger side door. Maggie peeked out first, cautious as ever, her ears perked forward. Rusty jumped out before Walt could stop him, landing on the soft grass with an excited bark. Daisy followed, then Buddy, each one more confident than the last. Charlie, still weak, was carried in Walt's arms. Maggie circled them, uncertain, sniffing the air like she was expecting danger. Eileen took a step forward but stopped short, letting Maggie come to her on her own time. "I got their bed set up in the sunroom," Eileen said softly. "Warm blankets, heating pad. Even brought in that old playpen we used for the grandkids." Walt gave a tired smile. "They'll be safer here than I ever was." Eileen didn't laugh. Not because it wasn't funny, but because she knew the truth behind his words. This home had seen joy and pain in equal measure. And now it was about to see healing too. Maggie stood at the edge of the porch, tail low, head high, eyes scanning every creak in the wood. Eileen crouched slowly, palm out. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered. Maggie stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and pressed her nose into Eileen's hand. No barking, no growling, just a quiet moment of surrender. Not of fear, but of recognition, as if she sensed something in Eileen that felt familiar. Steady, kind. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and cedarwood. Walt placed Charlie in a warm bed near the fireplace, wrapping him gently in an old quilt. The other pups began exploring the room, tumbling over boots and bumping into furniture. Maggie followed them closely, always guarding. But something in her had changed. Her body wasn't so rigid. Her eyes weren't so wide. This place felt different. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled softly, Maggie lay down in the center of the room, surrounded by her babies. Walt and Eileen watched from the couch, neither saying a word. For the first time since that frozen roadside, Maggie fell asleep without fear. 2 weeks had passed since Maggie and her pups arrived at the Jenkins home. The snow had begun to melt, leaving behind patches of brown grass and muddy tracks across the yard. Inside the house, though, life had started to bloom again. Rusty, Daisy, Buddy, and Charlie had grown stronger by the day. Their legs were sturdier, their personalities brighter. Charlie still coughed sometimes, but his eyes were clearer now, filled with something that looked a lot like mischief. Walt watched them play on the porch one morning, his coffee steaming in the cold air. Maggie sat nearby, calm but alert, her gaze sweeping from one pup to the next like a sentinel. She had softened, no longer pacing every time a car passed or flinching when someone stood too fast. But there was still something behind her eyes, a sense that she was waiting. For what, Walt wasn't sure. Maybe for someone to tell her this was really permanent, that it wasn't just another stop along the way. Eileen joined him on the steps, holding her own mug and a folded envelope in her other hand. "The vet called," she said softly. "They're healthy enough now to be listed for adoption." Walt nodded but didn't say anything. He knew it was coming. Knew it from the moment he pulled over on that icy road. But now that it was real, that these little lives might be going to strangers, and Maggie could be separated from them, the weight of it sat heavy on his chest. "We can't keep all of them, Walt," Eileen added gently. "You know that. We're not young anymore. For puppies and their mama, that's a full-time job." Walt sighed. "I know, I do. But it doesn't feel right splitting them up yet. Not after everything." He looked out at Maggie, who had begun licking Charlie's ear while he slept beside her. "They're still so bonded. It'd be like pulling a thread out of something that's not done being stitched." Later that day, they sat at the kitchen table, the adoption forms spread out between them. Eileen tapped her finger against the paper. "We could keep one," she offered. "Maybe Charlie. He's still fragile. He'd need more care." Walt stared at the form, then back toward the sunroom, where Maggie lay curled with all 4 of her pups. He rubbed his jaw, conflicted. Keeping one meant saying goodbye to the others. But keeping them all, was that even possible? The room fell quiet as Walt stood up and walked to the sunroom doorway. He looked at Maggie. She lifted her head and met his eyes. And in that silent exchange, he realized something. Maybe the decision wasn't his to make alone. The next morning was unusually quiet. The house held that kind of stillness that only comes when a decision has been made, even if no one said it out loud yet. Walt walked out to the porch, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the first signs of spring peek through the melting snow. The pups were curled up in a bundle on a patch of old blanket Maggie had dragged outside herself. She lay next to them, alert but peaceful, her eyes following Walt's every move. Not out of fear anymore, but out of curiosity, like she was waiting to see what he would choose. Inside, Eileen stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window with her arms crossed. The adoption papers were still sitting on the table and signed. She'd called the vet earlier and asked them to hold off for a few days. She wasn't ready. Walt wasn't either. But reality had a way of pushing people forward whether they were ready or not. Still, some choices didn't come from logic. Some came from the gut or the heart. That afternoon, a pickup pulled into the driveway. It was Dr. Martha Sinclair, bringing supplies and checking on Charlie. She smiled wide when she saw him trotting toward her, still a little wobbly, but full of life. "Looks like someone decided to stick around a little longer," she said, bending to scratch behind his ears. Maggie came up behind him, not growling, just watching. Martha looked up at Walt. "You thinking about placing them?" Walt hesitated. "We were. Still are." Martha nodded, sensing the weight in his voice. "Well, let me know. I've got 3 good families already asking. But no pressure." She turned back to Charlie. "Though I'll admit, I think this little guy's already made his choice." Charlie had crawled between Walt's boots, tail thumping against the wood. Maggie sat beside him, then slowly leaned into Walt's leg. That evening, as the fire cracked inside and the pups snored softly in their corner, Walt and Eileen sat in silence. Finally, Eileen spoke. "We said no more animals." Walt smiled faintly. "We say a lot of things we don't mean." He reached over, picked up the adoption forms and slowly tore them in half. Not out of defiance, but out of peace. The kind that only comes when the heart knows it did the right thing. Out on the porch under the stars, Maggie curled herself around her 4 pups one last time. Not as a mother holding on in desperation, but as a dog who had finally found a place to stay, a place to heal, a place to begin again.